Okay, Kayleigh, Elisa, are you there?
Yes, we're here.
Hello, hello, hello. How are we doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. Bright and sunny for the first time in like 2 months, so I'm really happy.
I'm
Um,
all in my sunshine. It was sunny here yesterday. It's very grey today.
oh, you're in Edinburgh. Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully it's coming your way soon. So let's kick off. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We've got a big, packed room today. So yeah, thanks for joining. Just a couple of quick housekeeping tips. This is being recorded, and it will be shared after. So if you're asking questions, don't share any sensitive information about your DSARs. Don't want those employee tribunals getting any more complicated than they have to be. Um, and other than that, we're gonna dive straight in, and we're gonna kick off with some introductions. I'm Mitch. I'm Director of Revenue at Trust Keith, and I'm going to be your host today. I'm joined by two fabulous guests. So Kayleigh, over to you for a quick intro.
Hi, I'm Kayleigh. I'm the lead DPO at Trust Keith. I've been working with privacy and data protection for longer than I care to remember, but originally come from an operations background, so try and look at things from as much of a proportionate lens as I can.
Thank you. And Lisa, over to you.
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm Elisa. I'm the HR advice manager at CharlieHR. So yeah, great to be with everyone today. Thank you so much for having me. For those of you who aren't familiar with CharlieHR, we provide all-in-one HR software designed specifically for small to medium-sized businesses. And the platform helps teams manage employee records, time off, performance, onboarding. So everything's in one place and making HR simpler and more efficient. And actually, alongside the software, we also have a HR advice add-on. That's the team that I lead on. And we support lots of different customers with the people side of running their business. So everything from employee relations issues to compliance to policies, contracts, and also best practice guidance. So essentially, we're there when something tricky comes up or when organizations just really want to make sure that they're doing things the right way.
Yep, and we are customers of Charlie HR, so we can vouch for Charlie and say they're excellent. So if you're not already using them, now's the time to get across and switch. So for today's webinar, we are doing a deep dive into employee DSARs. As quick context, at TrustKeep, we effectively offer outsourced data protection officer as a service and privacy management software. And this issue comes up all the time, and an increasing amount as well. So we felt it necessary to do a bit of a deep dive into DSARs and specifically employee ones. These are our guests for today. We've done our introductions. And in terms of agenda, we're going to run through a couple of things. What is a DSAR? What counts? Why are they always as challenging as they feel? And we're going to get stuck into a bit of a scenario of an employee DSAR and just talk for effectively how you should be navigating that. So to kick us off, Kayleigh, over to you. Do you want me sharing this now, or should I come back to it in a moment?
Let's come back to that in a moment, shall we?
Okay, yeah, let's come off.
Thank you. So what the question was, what is a DSAR? What counts as a DSAR? So to pick, without wanting to sound like the boring GDPR person with the boring hat on, but a DSAR is a data subject access request. It's a form of data subject right. So the GDPR, UK GDPR, and lots of other privacy regulations, they kind of build in a bunch of rights that individuals who organizations hold data on have. And DSARs are one of those. So it's under a lot of privacy regulations. There's the GDPR, but there's also the CCPA has the California Consumer Privacy Act has a version of DSAR as part of it. And basically what it means is that an individual can ask an organization for a copy of all of their data and supplementary information. Organizations then have to respond within a designated time frame. So that's like the basics of what a DSAR is designed to be. But increasingly, they are actually being used for around employment. They're being used for pre-litigation mechanisms, linked to employment claims, linked to dismissals, linked to requests for settlement, essentially. So it's very common to receive a DSAR from solicitors acting on behalf of employees looking to obtain settlement. It's increasingly common now to get requests that look very, very formal and very, very legal from data subjects. And in fact, we actually had a question about this, which was about upset levers using ChatGPT. So like it is becoming increasingly common. LLMs are being used to produce very official, very legal sounding requests. Although they sound very official and very legal, they are worth reading with a fine-tooth comb. A really common example that you see is that they will quote Section 45 of the Data Protection Act 2018, and you have to be a geek like me to immediately know that that actually pertains only to the police. So but the LLM doesn't know that. So, you know, they do need reading carefully. And although they are a bit of a pain, frankly, and a bit of a mischief, it's absolutely within the individual's right to make that access request. They don't need to be made in perfect language. They don't need to use any particular form of language or be made in any particular way. It was not how the right was intended, but it absolutely is the reality of the world right now. So data subjects do have the right to make these requests.
Nice. Why do they feel more difficult than they maybe need to be? Because whenever I speak to a customer of ours about DSARs, it's always the employee ones that come up first, and you can see the trauma on their face. So why is that from your perspective?
I think trauma is the right word, actually. It does feel really traumatic, and it sounds super dramatic. I talk about like the emotion that's linked to data protection a lot, and people look at me like I've fallen out of a tree. But like there is an emotional dimension to it. Requests are usually tied to grievances. People don't make these just because they're like having a boring day and they're like, oh, I'll ask an LLM to make a DSAR for me. They do it because there's a grievance, there's a redundancy, there's some kind of perceived wrongdoing, and they're looking for a smoking gun. Like they feel wronged and they want something out of it. And then on the other side of it, there's the team that receives it. Well, they usually feel a lot of pressure because sometimes they don't know how they're supposed to action it. Like it feels very intense. You know, there's a looming pressure. There's a 30-day deadline, which sounds like a long time when you say it at first, but then you realize that, well, the weekends are immediately gone. You probably didn't get it for 2 days after the request was made. And the redaction at the end is going to take loads of time. So, you know, this pressure kind of builds. It builds and builds and builds. Added on to that, like a lot of organizations think that it's just not going to happen to them. And so they don't prepare for them. Or they've got a plan that's on paper, but no one's looked at it in ages. No one knows where the data actually lives. You know, they're not doing lots of things. So overall, like all of these things add up to it feeling like an attack and that trauma.
Yes. And so, Elisa, I feel like we're kind of between TrustKeith and CharlieHR, we're sitting on two sides of the same coin. So you've got TrustKeith acting as the DPO coming in to help support. And then on the CharlieHR side, you're obviously being contacted as their HR advisor. So what about from your perspective, like why are they so problematic and what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, completely agree with Kayleigh. This is something that we see increasingly when there's grievances and redundancies and when people are negotiating for higher settlements as well. And I also think that there's been, at the moment, over the last like year or 2 years, there's been a massive increase in digital collaboration tools being used. So we've now got loads of discoverable data. So people record all the meetings that they have. So we've got AI note takers, we've got automatic transcripts, we have all calls being recorded, maybe auto-saved drafts, and even chat histories now are all being saved. And actually, this is just creating a huge amount of data. And what we find is that the companies that we speak to, they're frequently really surprised by what actually qualifies as personal data. And actually, if an individual can be identified, even directly, then it might fall within the scope of a DSAR. So like companies need to be really careful about casual comments that they make or opinions or even internal discussions that they're having about employees, because all of this can be disclosable. And also, like Kayleigh mentioned, it takes a really long time to deal with a DSAR. And I think many companies that we work with, they really underestimate how long the collection takes. And if you're managing the DSAR, what you're also doing is you're dependent on many different people across the organization who might also be conducting their own searches, whilst also continuing with their normal everyday roles as well. And actually, in smaller businesses, if you don't have someone that's, you know, dedicated for compliance or legal team, actually dealing with a DSAR can become quite resource intensive, and it can take a lot of valuable time up as well. And as Kayleigh mentioned, it also takes a really long time to review and redact the information, and every document has to be checked for third-party data and confidential business information, even legally privileged content as well. and actually just making sure that those redactions are done carefully and consistently, it does create a lot of anxiety for companies as well, because they want to make sure that they're doing everything correctly. So I think that's where I think that it can feel harder, and why some companies often trip up as well.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely agree. Two quick points off the back of that. One, we had a question, what is an LLM? That's a large language model. It's basically a ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, tools like that. And one point you just made, which we're going to touch on a lot, but just to be clear, if there's one thing you can take away from this, it's the importance of driving awareness amongst your employees that the information that they put in their systems about people, those people do have a legal right to access that. The most common slip up we see is recruitment notes, when in-house recruiters are putting notes and often like negative opinions about people. Like technically those people have a right to see it, so just be careful what you're putting into your systems. Right, Kayleigh, anything else to add? Otherwise we're going to jump into our scenario, and I'll share my screen.
The last thing that I would actually just say is that because we are increasingly, there's been a trend over the last few years to increasingly see these being linked to, settlement claims. There can sometimes be a tendency for organisations to receive a DSAR as part of a claim and think, let's not do anything about it because it'll probably go away. Either the claim will be settled or something will happen, and that leads to the kind of like backloading all of the pressure, because if it doesn't, you still have a legal obligation to comply. So you always need to kind of treat these requests, and then it adds to the pressure. Like, you need to treat the request as if it's going to happen, even if you're not sure if it's going to happen, and like have that process in place. But I thought that was a qualification that's worth making.
Yeah, agreed. Nice. Thanks, Kayleigh. On that note, I'm just going to share my screen and we can jump in. So, Kayleigh, do you want to give us a run through of this scenario?
Yes. So the scenario that we've got here is that we have a team member who has been made redundant. That team member has then
I'm going to reshare that. Give me 2 seconds. Keep going. I'm just going to reshare it.
So a team member's been made redundant. The team member was formerly in the business for around 20 years. They've had multiple roles. They've worked in multiple countries. They've worked with multiple managers. And so the breadth of the type of information that could be requested is pretty significant. In this particular example, this individual has gone to a solicitor who are acting on their behalf, and has made the legal firm acting on their behalf has made a really comprehensive data subject access request. Some access requests that you will see are pretty vague. It will just be like, can I have some data? And then you've got an opportunity to kind of clarify and to narrow the scope. But in this instance, they've been very deliberate and specific. So at the top here, you'll see that they're referencing the subject access request. They don't have to do that, but because it's a legal firm, they are. They're spelling out that they want information on the types of processing. And if we can move on to the next part of the letter, then we'll get into the kind of meat of what they're asking for. So they're asking for access to all of the personnel and HR files, performance reviews, appraisals, capability document, all of the redundancy planning documentation, internal communications. Notably, this includes instant messages on WhatsApp, notes of meetings, documents concerning alternative roles, complaints, grievances, metadata, and copies of any data shared with external advisors. So a really broad scope of what is being asked for here within a 30-day period. So this is what you might want to term a bit of a nightmare scenario.
Elisa, over to you. Where are some of the most common mistakes and that you see when you come across this type of scenario?
I think in a scenario like this, I mean, we've got an employee that's been with the business over 20 years. So already they're going to have tons of data, but also they've worked across multiple sites. They've reported maybe to different managers, and in also different countries as well. So that's going to mean that their data is scattered everywhere, not just in CharlieHR or HR platform or the personnel file. There's so much data here that's being requested. And actually, if you only look at the HR platform or only just some things, then you won't be fulfilling the request properly. And actually, when you're collecting decades of data across multiple systems, it takes a really long time. I think some businesses often assume that it'll be quick. I mean, in this situation, it's a very, very comprehensive list of requests, but actually this is going to take quite a long time, and in reality a really lengthy process in such a short space of time. And there's also going to be a lot of redaction involved in this. There's going to be older records, 20 years of records. They're going to mention people's names, clients, commercial information. So I think it could be really easy to get it wrong, and you could accidentally end up sharing something sensitive or over redacting. And when you over redact, the response also feels incomplete. So I think, yeah, there's loads of things here that would make it quite complex, very difficult. And I also think DSARs like this one, they can also expose governance gaps and inconsistent record keeping. And in this scenario, the employee might be using it, as part of this smoking gun or to secure a settlement. We spoke earlier about how they're commonly used in situations like that. And like Kayleigh mentioned earlier, a company might just say, okay, well, I'd rather settle or deal with a situation rather than having to deal with this big long request as well.
Nice. We've had a couple of quick questions, so I'm going to go through those. One of them's anonymous. By the way, if you submit anonymous questions, feel free to contact us directly at the end if you'd like to have a bit more of an open conversation. So first question is, to what extent are you allowed to regularly delete data, i.e. chat logs on Slack? Not after a DSAR has been requested, but just as general practice. Kayleigh, I see you smiling, so you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you clarified not after a DSAR. That would be an issue. Yeah, I mean, every organisation should have retention periods in place. The data protection regulations all state that you should keep data for no longer than is necessary. So you should absolutely have a process in place in your organisation to determine what it means to keep it for as long as necessary, and don't keep it any longer than that. You absolutely should be deleting those chat records when the data hits that retention period. You obviously don't want to delete it too soon, because then you're not going to have the data that you need. But yeah, absolutely, retention periods are a very important part of the way that organizations operate under data protection regulation. However, if data is deleted after a DSAR request, then that is a very serious issue that could land you in a lot of hot water. So please don't do that.
Yeah, I think on deletion, definitely what I see when I'm working with our customers is there's almost this desire from the business to hoard data and just hang on to it for the sake of it. And this is one of the scenarios where there's actually a real benefit to deleting it. Another scenario is in the event of a breach, if you've deleted a lot of your historical data, then the risk profile goes down. So there are pros to deleting data as well as cons. Elisa, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Kayleigh answered everything.
Nice. And then we had one more question. I might have to come back to a few of these at the end. I had understood that communications with our lawyers was non-disclosable as legal advice. Is that incorrect?
If it's privileged legal advice, then yes, privileged legal advice is protected and excluded. However, if there are other types of communications, maybe with a consultant that's been looking at it that doesn't fall under the privilege banner, then it's absolutely discoverable in a DSAR. So it's worth being careful about what is shared and what's not. Obviously anything that's under legal privilege you shouldn't share. There are certain exemptions. So things like sorry, I'm struggling to remember now. There's certain exemptions that you can go through, but you need to document why you're applying them. But for the most part, if it's personal data, it will be discoverable under a DSAR.
Thank you. Lots of questions, which I love to see. We definitely will get to all of them. And if we don't, we'll email you an answer. I'll come back to a few of these questions shortly. For now, Kayleigh, would you like to just jump back onto our scenario? It'd be great to hear from your perspective some of the common pitfalls when it comes to handling a DSAR like this.
Yeah, of course. So when you see DSARs like this, I mean, by its nature, this is going to be complex in the first place. But a couple of common pitfalls that you'll see is if you've got an inaccurate or unreliable data register or ROPA. So if you haven't updated your ROPA recently, you know, Elisa mentioned at the top of the call, there's this like flurry now of tools that are capturing personal data. You might be using an AI tool to record your meetings. You might be using various different pieces. You know, lots of new technologies come out. If they're not in your data register, it's going to be harder to find that stuff. So that is going to be a problem for you. Generally speaking, also like a lack of governance around personal devices and also increasingly around AI is going to cause you kind of three core issues. There's like a visibility issue where you just can't correctly identify where the data is. There's a control issue where you don't know that you can kind of consistently retrieve and or delete it. And then there's an explainability issue. You can't clearly describe like how it's actually being used or whether if there was any automated decision making that was involved. So what I could do is like link a couple of these directly back to the scenario. So if we imagine that with that redundancy scenario, in this particular instance, like the redundancy was discussed in private WhatsApp channels. And the DSAR, as you'll see on the letter, specifically asks for internal communications between managers, HR, etc., etc. So those communication channels have been specifically called out, but there's no central archive. HR doesn't know that the group exists, and managers have always considered it to be informal. Don't really think that this should apply. So then you have a question of like, well, what actually constitutes a reasonable search? Another piece that could be linked to a scenario like this is around AI. And again, like maybe you've got a scenario which really is like a dread scenario, which is your regional manager has been using a completely open, free version of a large language model or an AI to summarize performance reviews, draft comparative scoring notes, suggest language or rationale, and has actually put the employee's personal data into the tool. And again, like that request specifically states any details of automated decision making, including profiling. And the problem there is that like the AI usage wasn't logged and no DPIA has been conducted. So like there's just no documentation of what was input or generated. And so yeah, you can't confidently answer was there profiling.
Kayleigh, what is reasonable in context of like how far the search goes?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And like the truth is that there's a variety, like again, it depends is the answer. It's my favorite answer to everything.
Yeah.
But what is reasonable, like there's a line between like seizing everyone's mobile phones and searching for messages, and making sure that you can actually accurately fulfill this request. So what you need to do really is like an example of what would be proportionate in this case would be to reach out to the managers involved and ask them in writing to conduct a search on the chat groups that you know exist or that have been mentioned in the messages and say, conduct a search for this individual's name on these groups and confirm back what's been found. So like the difference between that and seizing phones obviously is pretty significant. What the regulator is going to look for is that you have made a significant effort to retrieve data, but that you haven't impinged on other people's rights by doing things like forcing them to surrender their own mobile phones.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And just, I guess, one point I just wanted to touch on. One of the first things you said is making sure that you've got an up-to-date record of processing activities, which is a legal requirement for pretty much everyone on there under the GDPR. So that it's really important that you have that, and if you have that in place, it will become much easier to respond to the DSAR because you'll be able to see where data is being processed, which systems you need to go into, etc. Kayleigh, question for you is: how often should you be updating a ROPA? The number of kind of stale ROPAs we've found that haven't been updated in 2 years is high. So what's like the reasonable kind of frequency to be updating a record of processing activities?
Again, it depends on the organization and the speed at which you're moving. Like really a ROPA should be updated, or your data register should be updated whenever you've got anything new that's happening or any changes within the organization. So best practice is to have a mechanism by which like your team members know there's been a change to this or there's something new and it goes straight in. My recommendation to teams is typically like do a sense check on it once a quarter, have a proper review of it at least once annually to make sure that it's up to date. But with the speed at which technology is moving, like if you know that your teams are introducing new AI or new technologies, do it more frequently.
Okay, cool. One other quick. So I'm seeing a couple of questions come up about reasonable retention periods. Again, I'm sure it depends, but what's your a headline answer to that one? Then we can go on to our next section.
So it depends. Yeah, it really does depend. Depends on
It
the type of,
depends.
it depends. Depends on the type of data, depends on the platform, and it depends on your use case for it. So there's also like reasonable and proportionate efforts. So like in some instances, it may not be possible to delete. Like for example, employee records, there's like a legal requirement to keep them. You have to keep them in line with a certain period of time. But for like chat logs, well, if they pertain to a customer, you might need to keep them for the length of the customer, and then a period of time after that that gives you reasonable time to close everything out. So unfortunately, there is no the tricky thing about data protection sometimes is that there's not like a set period that I can tell you. The best thing that you can do for your business is do a case by case analysis and say like genuinely, how long do we need this for? The answer is never, always, forever. Like, and think about the risk that's entailed with it. Like, what's the benefit of keeping this? Are we actually ever really going to look at it, or is it just going to sit somewhere clogging up our databases and emitting carbon from data centers and ruining the planet?
Yeah.
Like, should we just get rid of it? You can tell where I fall on that side of the argument, right?
Elisa, anything you'd like to add? If not, I'll go on to our next section.
No, all good. Thank you.
Okay. So next, then we've spoken a bit about some of like the biggest challenges that are being faced here. Kayleigh, would you like to give us a bit of a context on what a good DSAR process looks like? Yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah. So I suppose for all that I've said so far, the most important thing when you get a DSAR is like genuinely don't panic. Like it is not a personal attack. It is a legal request. And although it may feel fraught with emotion, it's really important not to kind of treat it like the sky is falling. The best way, and I know that this sounds dreadfully Girl Scout of me, but like the best way to make sure that you have a smooth process is to be prepared for it and to put the steps in place before you get one. But the three core steps of a DSAR, once you have got one, is verify it. So verify that the individual is who they say they are or is acting on behalf of the individual. So with the example of our solicitor's letter, at the end, they've said they're including documentation to show that they're acting on behalf of the individual. You also want to verify the scope of the request. So in some instances, there's an opportunity to be really clear about, okay, what's the dates that we're looking at? Are you looking at anyone in particular, any particular subjects? Like narrow it down as much as is reasonable for the data subject. The second step is to identify, so like go away and actually find out where the data is. Hopefully this is a really simple step because you've got a super brilliant, shiny, up-to-date record of processing activity that lists everything out and you know where everything lives. But identifying that data can take a while. So be prepared for the fact that it can take a while. But also be prepared for the fact that the third step, which is collating the information, always takes longer than you think it's going to. So like pulling it together always takes a bit longer. Give yourself time for this part. So right at the start of the DSAR process, like scope it out in your head and say, how long am I going to need to take for the collation and redaction? How long does that give everyone to come back to me? Set the deadline a few days before that so I've got time to chase everyone about the deadline that they've all just powered through because they've got 12 other things that they're trying to do. But when it comes to the collating, then what you're looking at is bringing together all of that information into like a presentable format, ideally a format that matches the request, making sure that you're not including anything that you shouldn't, doing your redaction, and then getting it out to the data subject in line with that 30-day period.
Nice, thank you. And Elisa, what would you add to that? And once we've come to the end of that section, I'm going to take a few questions.
Okay. So I think there's a few things that it's worth pointing out from like a HR angle. And I think the first, with a DSAR, it's really good to have clear ownership. So if you have a dedicated DSAR owner, maybe someone in HR or a senior manager if you're a smaller business, that's really, really important. And then they can help map out a clear workflow of how the DSAR will be managed. And also they can make sure that the deadlines are being tracked carefully as well. And I think if you do just have clear ownership, it helps avoid confusion. You've got accountability, and it also gives the employee a consistent point of contact. And then the second is thinking about employee support and well-being. So we've spoken a lot about how DSARs are stressful, they're emotionally charged, especially if they are linked to grievances or redundancies or any other conflicts. And I think from a HR perspective, it is really important to approach this as a supportive process as well as a compliance process as well. So as I said, making sure that you've got a clear point of contact who can answer questions and guide an employee through the process, and explaining what they can expect in terms of a timeline, or maybe what data will be shared, what might be excluded. And then you can also think about other emotional support. So maybe signposting the employee to any benefits that you've got. Maybe you've got an employee assistance program. Maybe you offer healthcare. It might be that the manager can have weekly check-ins with this person while the DSAR is being completed. I think employee support and well-being is really important as part of this process. And then the final thing I talk about is continuous improvement. I mean, in HR, we should always be thinking about how we can improve our processes. And I think after completing a DSAR, you can review the process and you can look at what worked well, what took so long, where are those governance gaps, or where did some inefficiencies appear? And then you can start to look at updating policies, maybe having communication templates, and then thinking about maybe manager training based on those learnings as well. And I think if you do this kind of ongoing review, then this will help reduce future risks. It'll help support with a better employee experience. And I think overall, just from a HR angle, it's really important to try and be proactive and strengthen processes, because that will help in the future protect the business and also employees as well.
Yeah, I think the well-being point is very important. There's been a fair few in the time I've been at Trustkeith, scenarios where you're working with someone internally on the DSAR and you can just see the stress sitting on them. So if you're the person managing that person, definitely look out for that. That's definitely an important one. Right, I'm going to try and get through a couple of questions. I'm trying to kind of categorize them together. It feels like there's questions about scope and how far people have to go. So, for example, one of the questions here is, so would things like reviewing AI note takers and WhatsApp groups only need to be reviewed if mentioned in the DSAR? And then the follow-up to that is, what would justify an extension? Kayleigh, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, so where it comes to your AI note takers, I hate to say the word, it depends again, but it depends on what the scope of the request is. So they don't actually need to mention those tools specifically, but if what is in those tools pertains to the scope of the request, then yes. So for example, if they are asking for details on redundancy and there is personal information that pertains to the redundancy within those AI tools, then yes, they should be included in the scope. You don't have to give individuals things that they're not asking for, but they don't need to ask about the tools. So if they're asking for HR records between 2018 and 2020, you don't need to give them 2016 or 2025, but you do need to search all of the tools that you have for the information that they are asking for. Yeah.
And what happens if an employee has been using like a personal ChatGPT, and they say like, oh, I don't want to share anything from my personal ChatGPT? What kind of how to tackle that?
I mean, if they've been using it with personal information in it, and you have a couple of internal questions that you need to be asking. First, it's like, is that in line with your AI governance? And if you don't have any AI governance, big lesson learned, go and get some AI governance. But if they are using that personal tool for work purposes and then they're refusing to disclose it, that I mean, I would defer to Elisa on this, but that would seem like an employment issue with me. And certainly it means that you would not technically be compliant with the DSAR, and there could be questions that come back as a result of that.
Nice. Elisa, any thoughts on that from an employment perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one because it's balancing that private life with then the personal information being in like ChatGPT. So it depends on the situation, but it may be then that you would need to look at having some formal conversations with this team member if they were refusing to share any data that's on, in their personal ChatGPT.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. And as for AI governance, Kayleigh, that's probably another session for another day. But definitely important that there is some sort of strategy around or guidance to employees. around which tools to use and how to use them. Just something that, yeah, go on.
Yeah, and not even just AI, actually. Like AI governance, super important because it's a thing that people are doing now, and a lot of people don't realize that they shouldn't be doing it or what the parameters of it are. I think most people know that they shouldn't be putting personal data into it, but actually, like also making people aware of how they should and shouldn't be using personal messaging platforms, things like WhatsApp, you know, like maybe it's worth considering having some rules around how you use those tools, knowing that they could be discoverable. Or at least making
Yeah.
people aware of the fact that it could be discoverable, so you don't end up with this difficult situation where they say no.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to take one more question, then we're going to move on. One of the questions I think is in response to what I said about. So the question is, what advice is there about internal communications? It seems that we can't have any written communications about our staff, and any controversial discussions would need to be verbal. Conversational being potentially starting at a protected conversation. So yeah, I kind of get that, because sometimes it's impractical to have all of those conversations and take anything controversial out of written format. Like it's probably not practical or realistic to do that. So welcome both of your thoughts on how to tackle that one.
I would probably say that like sometimes there's a line between what you want someone to see and what is not lawful or not acceptable. Like you can have a controversial opinion where you say, I don't believe that this individual is performing. That is your opinion if there's evidence, you know, something else. But it's completely different if you're having a conversation that is discriminatory. That I mean, that just shouldn't be happening, whether it's on paper or otherwise. Like
Yeah.
so,
Okay.
like controversial opinions can happen, do happen, but it's actually about like what the employee is looking for is a smoking gun and making sure that you're doing things in the right way.
And just to add to that as well, I think it's all about the tone and the way that you have
Yeah.
conversations. I think, like Kayleigh said, it's absolutely fine to have an opinion on someone's performance, but you know, speaking in a derogatory way, if you wouldn't want the person to hear what you've said in the way that you said it, then don't say it in that way. It's just being really mindful about what you say and how it comes across.
Yeah, thanks. I think that makes a ton of sense. Okay, let's go on to our next section. Kayleigh, do you want to give us some context on how to respond with confidence to the scenario DSAR that we've got?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, like Girl Scout, the way to have responded with confidence is to have been prepared in from the get-go, and to know that you've got this process. When you're responding, like legally, there are a few things that a response must include. So you need to confirm, like whether the personal data is being processed. In this instance, we know that it definitely is. Like you need to include the copies of the personal data, the purpose of processing, categories, recipients, retention periods, and the individual's rights, and then information about data sources if the data wasn't directly obtained. And you also need to include details of any automated decision making. So that's what you need to include kind of legally. When it comes to setting this out, my recommendation, particularly for a kind of complex DSAR like that, is to look at the categories that the data subject or their representative has called out and like group it in that way, because it makes it easier to group the response for you going back. You can be more confident about how that's been done. But then in terms of like actually being able to manage it and respond to it, if you don't mind, I would like to share my screen. Oh no. Oh, I can't. Okay. Never mind. Sorry, it's not letting me. Anyway, it's fine. What I was going to do is just show you a quick snapshot of the TrustKeith platform. But really just to show you those three things that I mentioned already. So the platform that we have allows us to walk through these three steps in process. So the review step, where we identify, it gives us a ticking clock so we know how long we've got at every stage. The processing stage, so like being able to link back to your data register. Again, like the TrustKeith product, it's really nice. It will automatically flag which bits of the data register have that employee data in. But however you do it, whether it's through TrustKeith or otherwise, like giving yourself that time in processing to refer to your data register and find all of that stuff. And then the final part is like resolving it. So collating it, redacting it, and then responding to the data subject or their representative, setting out everything that's there. Like being careful about that last part, how you're communicating. So if you are only fulfilling the request in part, saying that telling them why. If you've applied any exemptions, say that, tell them why. So all of that, just setting it out nicely, responding, being prepared for the fact that sometimes these are challenged. So once it's gone, look at what you've done, recognize that you might get a challenge back that asks some more questions, be prepared for it if that happens. And the final piece that I would say in all of it is once you've done all of that, like every DSAR, particularly the really complex ones, are an opportunity to learn something. Like learn about a system that wasn't on the data register, learn about someone who was listed as your point of contact but actually left the business, learn about something that could have been smoother. You know, I worked on one about a year ago where the individuals forgot to notify IT that they needed to look for anything, and so they didn't know. You know, like that was an opportunity to learn. Tell IT. You know, there's always an opportunity to learn something, and so take that step back afterwards and feed it back into your process to make it better the next time.
Nice. Thanks, Kayleigh. We'll see if we can sort out the sharing issue. But in the meantime, Elisa, anything you would add to that?
I think how to respond with confidence from a HR angle. I think the first is like aiming for quite a professional, neutral, empathetic tone. I think we've spoken a lot in today about how DSARs are quite emotional, but I think when you're going through that process, when you respond, just make sure that you are avoiding defensive language and you're explaining everything as clearly as you can do. And also, if there is an ongoing employee relations situation, so, you know, you've got a grievance or a disciplinary or redundancy, make sure that that process isn't going on hold. Obviously, it depends on the situation. There may be some situations where you do have to put that on hold and deal with the DSAR first, but if you can run those processes concurrently along with each other, then that would be really good so that you can keep both processes moving, especially if employees are waiting for answers or they're feeling anxious about a process that they're going through as well. And actually, if you're unsure on whether you should pause a process or whether you can continue, that's something that we can always support with in our team as well. I also think something that companies find really useful and helps give them confidence when dealing with DSARs is having clear escalation pathways, because DSARs can get quite complex. And I think if you have a clear escalation pathway in place, maybe seeking legal advice or going to Trust Keith or getting senior HR input, just knowing where to turn just gives you confidence and helps you ensure that the process is being handled properly. It may even be that you just need another pair of eyes or someone just to confirm what you're already thinking, but that just helps give you confidence throughout the process as well. And then the final thing that I think works really well for our customers is being really organized. And I think lots of confidence comes from being organized as well. So like knowing your data sources, workflows, knowing what your responsibilities are, maybe having templates ready, making sure that you've got policies. And even small businesses, I think, without a dedicated HR team can benefit from like a DSAR checklist or like other checklists and responses and templates to make sure that nothing's being missed and deadlines are being met. And I think that if you are really prepared, then that'll help protect the business, but it also makes the process smoother and less stressful for everyone involved as well.
Nice, definitely makes sense. We've had a question about policy templates. So we're going to be, just so everyone knows, as part of the follow-up, we're going to be sharing a data subject rights policy template that you can pick up and use as a baseline if you don't have anything. Although always stress it's important to review that and tweak it to what makes sense for your business. And we can also share an AI policy template as well. No reason that we can't add that in if someone's asked for it. So we'll definitely be able to share that. Kayleigh, anything do you want to maybe just comment on how to make the process, make your DSAR process repeatable and scalable? And then I'm going to come on to the many, many questions that we still haven't answered.
I mean, at the risk of again sounding like a Girl Scout and just repeating myself, be prepared, be prepared, be prepared, be prepared. Plan.
Yeah.
Know that these things can happen. Don't assume it's never going to happen to you. Like, have a plan for it. And if you've had one in the past, learn from what didn't go well in the past, or even if it went quite well, but there was one or two things that could have been done better, like learn from that. And that's really the key to like building confidence, but also making it repeatable and scalable. Did it go well? Yes, brilliant. What can we learn? Did it go badly? No. Okay, what do we learn? But then, the really basic pieces, like we talk a lot about data registers and ROPAs being up to date, and it's partly because I think it's really fun and I love it, but mainly it's because like it's really important as the basis for like when you get a DSAR, this is the document that you're going to go and look at that's going to tell you where stuff is. Like also making sure that you've got like that governance in place, that people know where they should be storing data and they're actually doing it, not just hoarding it in their inbox. That you've got like those really kind of solid structures in place. And if you can, before you get one, drill it. Like do a tabletop exercise. I love tabletop exercises because they will tell you where you're going to fail when it comes to the real thing.
What's a tabletop exercise? Just quickly, in case anyone doesn't know.
It's a drill. Yeah. So a practice drill. Pretend you've got one. Get the right people in the room and ask them what they would do and how they would action it.
Got it. Okay, cool. Right, let's go through a couple of the questions. I've got one that says, I've seen differing opinions on disclosure of emails. Some seem to think that every email addressed to a person is disclosable. Others say only when the content relates to the processing of their personal data. What's your stance?
It would be where it relates to the processing of personal data. If we were expected to disclose every email to every person, we would have it would be endless. But no, yeah, if it relates to the processing of data on the person.
Nice. Okay, that makes sense. Another question is, can we extend the process if it can't be completed within the month?
It depends. Is the answer to that. There are some circumstances in which an extension can be applied for. One of them is for what's known as a complex request, and that's something that a lot of people kind of grab onto and go, oh, this is complex, yank that. But actually what entails a complex request that is very specific according to the ICO. So there has to be a reason why you can't complete it within the 30 days. That should be either because you have to seek legal advice, and that should not be the legal advice around the settlement. That should be legal advice about whether or not you can legally disclose some of the information. It would be that you've got there's technical difficulties retrieving the information. And if you're relying on that, then you should only rely on it once, because if you get another one, the expectation is that you would have fixed that technical issue. So there are some reasons that you can apply an exemption, but they are very limited. And my strong advice would be, wherever possible, aim to do it within the 30 days.
Yeah, or if you're going to go for the extension, just make sure you're using one of the correct legal reasons for it, because there's going to be a lawyer on the other end or a DPO on the other end sense checking it. I think you say it.
Make sure it's being applied properly and that you're letting the data subject know. Also, if you are applying an extension, the best practice is to give them what you can within the 30 days anyway, and then apply the extension to the data that you can't retrieve for that reason.
Nice. Okay. Got another one that says, we were told by the ICO is the UK's data regulator, that tools which are not managed by the company are not mandatory to include in the output of a DSAR. E.g., we don't have a company WhatsApp account, so even if WhatsApp messages are included as part of the DSAR, we should not ask our team to share, but they do not have to share it if it's on a personal device. Does that seem correct to Elisa and Kayleigh?
I'm surprised that advice came from the ICO, to be completely honest with you, because that is not the way that the regulation is framed. And I would expect that a solicitor would come back and question that if that were the response that was put in. So like the regulation, it is clear that if it is personal data that is processed for the purposes of work, even if it's not in a work system, then it is discoverable.
Is there you imagine me as the head of people on the other side of Trust Keith, is there not a reasonable claim to say, like, it's not reasonable for me to go and start looking into personal devices? I can only look at what we manage as a company.
Yes,
it's not practical. We've got 200 employees or whatever.
There's absolutely the reasonable and proportionate piece of it. You cannot go and search 200 employees stuff like yourself. But what you can do reasonably and proportionately is to send a request to ask those employees to do that and come back to you with their findings. How you enforce that is then a kind of separate question.
Got you. Nice. Elisa, anything you'd like to add to that? No worries if not. Okay, cool. We have a couple more questions to run through. Loving all these questions. What happens if you change systems and no longer have access to the previous systems, which may have contained the requested information? So maybe you've cancelled a subscription to, I don't know, Slack.
What we've done before in the past, we've advised customers to put a request into that company to see if the data can be discoverable, and if they still have the data on their side. But otherwise, if the data has been deleted for whatever reason and that company doesn't have it anymore, then I suppose there isn't much that you can do in that situation.
Yeah, this is where the word reasonable comes in, right? There's only so far that you can push it. You've only got so much that you can do, and you've also got business to run. So yeah, Kayleigh, anything you would add to that?
No, exactly that. It's reasonable and proportionate. So if the data has gone past retention period, it's been, the data's gone, you don't have access to it anymore, it doesn't exist anymore. All fine and good.
Yeah.
If it should still be discoverable and it's not,
Mhm.
you just need to disclose that and say, like, this data no longer exists. The final piece that I would say is that, like, if there's an issue that means you've lost access, for example, like someone has moved on and therefore you don't have access to the login or something along those lines, and that's causing delays, that would be an instance where that technical extension could come in, and you could say, look, we are not going to be able to do this within 30 days because we've had a lever, the passwords are incorrect, whatever it is, and we need longer to be able to comply with this.
Nice. Okay, cool. So other ones that I think are interested. So we've got one that says, what company training and company policies are recommended to mitigate and manage these requests effectively? Kayleigh, I think probably one for you to start with anyway.
Yeah, in terms of training, your data protection, like basic data protection training, should cover like best practices along how you store and save data. You need to make sure that you've got your data register that's updated. Your data protection training should also cover specifically what is a DSAR, how to recognize a DSAR, and what that means. And then for teams that are most likely to get them, so any of your customer facing teams or your HR teams, I'd also recommend a specific session for those teams on managing that and like a tabletop exercise. In terms of policies and procedures, obviously having your ROPR up to date is important. Have a policy on data subject rights and how to enforce them. I'd also recommend having a policy or procedure on use of personal devices and how personal devices can be used, and also some kind of AI governance around how you expect personal data to or not to go into AI.
Nice. Elisa, what would you add to that in terms of company policies and training?
So yeah, I would say data protection policies, data retention policies, AI request and usage policies. That's something that we can help with at CharlieHR. I think there was a question in there. But yeah, we can support with data usage policies. And then I think another way that you can also just track the types of AI that teams are using is have some kind of request process in place where someone puts a request in, you review that request, and then you can also add that to the list of different tools and softwares that the team are using so that you've got a centralized list of everything that's being used. And then from a training perspective, we'd always recommend line manager training. So making sure that managers know how DSARs touch the areas that they work in, what data might be stored in their notes, emails, chat tools, etc. Just general data awareness training, especially with the rise of AI, making sure people know that there's a lot more discoverable employee data and that teams need to be aware of what they say in, emails, chats, recorded calls. And yeah, Kayleigh also mentioned personal device usage guidance. That's really, really vital as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just one comment to wrap that question up is that if you should, assuming you have an appointed DPO, whether it's an external DPO or an internal one, there should be some sort of basic governance in place whereby you sit down with that person, perhaps once per quarter, once every 6 months, and you assess of all of the things that we could be doing in regards to data protection. So there's a long list of things. Which of them are at the top of the list? And effectively, which of them pose the biggest risk to our business or opportunity? And it may be that DSAR sits at the top of that. But when you do that, there may be other things that you need to do first. So just one really fundamental thing is to make sure that there's some sort of basic governance in place that allows you to do that. Otherwise, you end up with a scenario where something goes wrong and effectively we're all firefighting, which is not obviously not the place we want to be. A couple more questions. We'll keep running through them. I think we covered that one. Is there any way to put upset levers using ChatGPT to waste? Oh yeah. So we got this question. Is there any way to stop upset levers using ChatGPT to waste everybody's time making DSARs out of only bitter motives? What a question. Who wants to take that? Elisa?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think, as we said earlier, DSARs are being used strategically and even vindictively to slow down processes or just cause loads of extra administrative work and put pressure in negotiations or situations. But essentially, the law gives individuals the right to access their personal data. So even if their intent is bitter, you can't deny a legitimate request. But what you can do is make sure that you manage it effectively and make it easier for the company by having clear policies, a clear procedure, making sure that you have control over the scope. So, you know, if the requests are overly broad, clarifying exactly what data will be provided or what they're asking for. Also, having templates and workflows will make it easier for you. And also just emotional management. I think DSARs, when they're submitted and you think that it's with negative intent, of course, that can create a lot of tension. So just making sure that you're mindful of your communication, you know, being neutral, because this will help mitigate disputes and also help mitigate any personal conflicts as well. Nice. But I think overall, yeah, upset levers can try and make DSARs burdensome, but I think if you do have a structured process, awareness and like limits, then you can prevent it from feeling like a time wasting exercise.
Nice. Yeah, agreed. Kayleigh, I've got one more question for you, which is, do you redact anything that isn't the person's personal information? E.g., the only thing they would be sent would be their name if it was included in a message. Would the rest of the message be redacted?
No, the only thing that you would redact would be like information about other individuals or anything that fell outside of the scope of the DSAR. So the fact that the individual's name is personal information, but if the message is also personal information, like a form of personal information, then that all needs to be included. So like personal information is any information that is linked to the individual or makes them identifiable. It's not just their name. So if they're asking for their the pieces were linked to the redundancy, you couldn't just send them the redundancy text with their names in it. It would need to be like the associated material. But what you should redact is anything that is like legally sensitive, is relating to a third party.
Nice, thank you. Oh, there's a lot covered, and we've still got a few more questions, but I am going to wrap up and then we'll be answering all of these questions in writing. So everyone knows, as a follow-up from this, we're going to send a follow-up email. It's going to have a recording. It's going to have a couple of policy templates that you can get stuck into. If you have questions about DSARs or the DPO role in general, or would like to inquire about the DPO role, there will be a means for you to contact us on that email. We can just go to our website. If you have questions or would like to inquire about using CharlieHR and specifically CharlieHR's HR advisory service, there will be a means to contact Elisa and the team in the email, but also you can also go to their website. Elisa, anything you would like to add from your side? And then Kayleigh, I'll give you a chance to wrap up.
No, just want to say thank you so much for having us on this session. And yeah, of course, you'll send our details if anyone wants to contact us about the software or about the advice service as well.
Thank you, Elisa. Kayleigh, anything to add?
No, just, you know, be prepared for the fact that it could happen. Look at what you've got. And if you need any support or if you've got a question, come and let us know.
Nice. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. And we'll see you next month on our next webinar, of course.
Thank you.
Thanks.